All
right.
It was keeping me safe.
So we'll get started because we can. So if people come in, they'll be able to ask more questions as we go, but I want to make sure that I respect your time for being here. So this is what's called an AMA, Ask Me Anything. As long as it's about cocoa and chocolate, we're not discussing my dating life. Unless it's related somehow to cocoa or chocolate. And the idea of an Ask Me Anything is that you've had a chance over the course of the last several hours or over the course of the next several hours to be speaking with all these chocolate makers. And they're going to leave you with questions about how chocolate is made, maybe the post-harvesting process, where cocoa grows and all these things. And I'm here to answer all of those questions for you, if I possibly can. All right? So if you don't have a question at hand, what I can do is I can just run an intro and just feel free to interrupt me. So I can lay claim to being the world's first professional chocolate critic. In 1994, I was in the south of France on a business trip, nothing to do with chocolate. And I ran into one of the world's first modern single origin chocolate producers. This is a French family that had been making chocolate since 1884. And for the 100th anniversary, they produced a series of 7 single origin chocolates. So this is a French company called Bonnat, B-O-N-N-A-T. And I bought the 7 bars back. But the story is that rather than going and spending all my francs, right, at duty free at the airport in Nice, I said, I'm just going to take a little short walk around Cannes, where I was, before I get on the shuttle to the airport. And you never know when an inconsequential decision, like I'm going to go take a walk as opposed to get in the car, is going to have a profound influence on your life. And so I ran into these chocolate bars because I took the walk around town, came back to New York City where I was living. Shortly thereafter, I had a dinner party in my apartment, and I opened up these chocolates and I shared them with everybody. It was a dinner party, my first quote-unquote chocolate tasting. And my only memory of that evening was that every single one of us had a different favorite chocolate for a different reason. They were all 75%, which means they all contained the same amount of sugar, but each one was from a different location. So 2 from Venezuela, a place called Puerto Cabello, and another one called Chihuahua, but from Madagascar and Trinidad and Ecuador, the Ivory Coast, and places like that. But I understood with my little French what Trinité meant as Trinidad, but where were Puerto Cabello? Where was Chihuahua? And so I had to go to the library and look up an atlas, because this is pre-Google, right, and figure out where these things were located. But I had spent the previous 10 years of my career working in high technology. So I'm an undergraduate fine arts major. I have a BFA in photography from Rhode Island School of Design. And I didn't get into the chocolate business because I love chocolate. I learned to love chocolate as a result of a business decision to get into chocolate. So I'm in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I've had this experience with this chocolate tasting, and I'm in a bookstore, probably a Barnes & Noble, looking at a magazine rack, and there's Architectural Digest and Cigar Aficionado and all these other magazines, and I realize, oh man, there's professional critics for everything you can think of, but there are no professional critics for chocolate. So I am going to become the world's first professional chocolate critic. That was one afternoon standing in the Upper West Side in a bookstore. 7 years later, I hung out my shingle on the internet to become a professional chocolate critic. At the time, 1994, I had no idea what it meant to be a chocolate critic. There were none. Where could I go to learn what it is that I needed to learn in order to do this? I just realized that I had some time. And I was extremely fortunate to have the family circumstances, which gave me the time to devote resources to be able to learn what it is that I needed to learn. And so my ex-wife's parents were both at Yale University, and so they knew a guy on the faculty by the name of Michael Coe, and Michael and his wife Sophie had written a book called The True History of Chocolate. So I had that connection. I was introduced to the importer of French and Italian gourmet chocolate in 1998, and so I went to work for them for a couple of years selling the Michel Cluizel, this French brand, and Domori, an Italian brand, into high-end pastry kitchens, including Michelin-starred restaurants in New York City, Right? So just really, really fortunate to be able to have found my way into the people who could teach me what it is that I needed to know. And that has been my career since early 2001, is to educate people about why this thing we call craft chocolate, we now call craft chocolate because that's not what we called it back then, why it's important, why it's different, and what we can do with it. So has anybody in the course of this actually defined what craft chocolate is and how does it differentiate craft chocolate from another chocolate?
They kind of told us the difference between craft chocolate and commodity chocolate.
And do you remember what they told you?
Well, craft chocolate is higher quality.
Okay.
And is more expensive.
Right.
And they don't add as much sugar.
Okay.
Usually a smaller producer.
Yeah.
So what I want to do is I want to think about craft chocolate in a different kind of way, right? Because while all of those things may or may not be true, I don't think they talk about the essence of what craft chocolate is, right? Which I think is important if we're here at a craft chocolate festival. And I want to compare craft chocolate with industrial chocolate rather than commodity, because we're going to use commodity in a slightly different way, right? So if I am an industrial chocolate maker, when I start out making chocolate, the end goal is already determined, right? So if you are a buyer of my chocolate, right, you are expecting the acidity, the pH to be the same, because if you're baking with it, you want it to leaven and rise the same way every single time, right? If I'm going to put it in a machine for enrobing, so for covering something with chocolate, I want the flow characteristics to be the same. Because if the flow characteristics change, it's called rheology, if it changes, I need to tweak my machines, all of them. And I don't want to be changing my machines every time I get a chocolate, right? If my customers expect a particular flavor, I want the flavor to be the same every single time. So an industrial chocolate maker, their entire motivation is to take whatever their ingredients taste like and to make them taste the same in the chocolate year after year. And as an agricultural commodity, cocoa tastes different from harvest to harvest to harvest and from location to location to location. So that is the definition of an industrial chocolate maker. Right? A craft chocolate maker says, ooh, I got some cocoa beans in front of me. What do I do to maximize the expression of flavor from those beans? And so the way to differentiate between a craft chocolate maker and an industrial chocolate maker is around this notion of intent. Right? My intent as an industrial maker is to make the same thing every time. My intent as a craft chocolate maker is to maximize the expression of flavor which the potential of the beans present to me. Right? And I know that the beans from this year are going to be different from next year, and I'm not concerned about the chocolate tasting exactly the same from the 2018 harvest to the 2019 harvest, or from the off harvest to the peak harvest. I just accept those. And these are things that we accept in wine. We accept the vintage wine. Every vintage is going to taste different. But if I purchase wine from the same vintage, from the same place, I expect it to be the same. But there's no expectation from years. However, when it comes to an industrial chocolate, I walk into a store and I see a bar from Lindt or Ghirardelli, Tony's Chocolonely, places like that. I expect it to taste exactly the same every single time. I don't want to be surprised. So I think when we talk about craft, we're not talking about the machinery that's used. So there's nothing about the machinery that makes it craft. There's nothing about the scale of production, right? You're a craft chocolate maker until you process a metric ton of beans a year. And then above that, you're no longer a craft maker. I mean, the definition of craft beer is 60 million barrels and no more than 25% beneficial ownership by a big company. That's a lot of beer, 6 million barrels. So I think it's really important to pare this back to something which doesn't have any added on assumptions. So we could say that this craft chocolate is ethically produced, but then you have to say, what is ethics? What are ethics? And are ethics the same as or different from morals, right? And then when I use the word ethical, what does that mean? So for me, I start off with a baseline, which is do no harm. So you're not going to take unfair advantage of any of your trading partners. You're not going to take unfair advantage of the farmers, but you're also not going to do anything which takes unfair advantage of the land, right? So when I say ethical, this is what I mean. When I say sustainable, This is what I mean. And ethical and sustainable are not the same things. You can't conflate them and try to put them all together. So if you have this notion of craft chocolate, the more things you pack on top of it, the harder it is to come to any agreement on what the definition is. Because some people say, well, I don't agree with your definition of ethics, or I don't agree with your definition of sustainable. And for me, the sustainable is you manage the resources, which is either the economic resources, the people resources, the environmental resources, and the communities in which the farmers live in a way that says they're healthy and thriving 100 years from now. So we want the farmers to be, and their families to be healthy and thriving. We want the farms to be healthy and thriving. All of these people live in communities which need to be healthy and thriving. And to be sustainable is to manage them in a multi-generational way. So we're not taking, how do I maximize return over the next quarter or over the next year? And so I think it's really important that we start, we might disagree on the fine details, but at least in broad, we agree with what's going on. So there is a formal definition within the industry between what is called commodity or bulk cocoa and what is considered to be fine and flavor cocoa, right? I don't like fine and flavor cocoa as a definition. I like what the coffee world uses, which is specialty. We have specialty coffee and commodity coffee. And in coffee, specialty coffee is any bean, which has been graded by professional Q graders, is receiving a certain score and above, right? As long as there is a consensus among Q graders that it receives like an 80 score, we consider it to be specialty coffee. And it doesn't matter what the origin of where the coffee comes from. It doesn't even matter what the genetics of the coffee are. And it doesn't matter anything about the processing. It's just that, it makes a good cup of coffee. And I want to use that same idea when it comes to cocoa. So the definition between commodity cocoa and what I think of as specialty cocoa is commodity cocoa really only produces cocoa and chocolate flavor, right? Whereas specialty cocoa gives you all the fruit and flowers and spices and nuts and all the other wonderful flavors that you can get. And that at the moment, there's no accepted equivalent to Q grading in cocoa, although that's starting to happen. And I believe sometime in the next decade or so, we might actually get to consensus around it. All right, so when I say craft chocolate, what I'm saying, I'm looking at a maker whose intent in making the chocolate is to filter the genetic potential of the cocoa beans and the way it has been processed at the farm, the way it's been fermented and dried, through my artistic expression as a chocolate maker. I need to have an artistic expression as a chocolate maker, right? And to make these beans. And that's why we'll have 3 different people who are using beans from the same producer, from the same harvest, will produce 3 very different chocolates. Right? Their roasting profiles are different. The way they, the other aspects of their recipe and processing may be different. And all of those things will affect the flavor of the finished chocolate. And in the end, what we do is we evaluate, as they do in specialty coffee, we evaluate the quote unquote quality of the cocoa beans based upon the chocolate that is made from them. Right? So quality is another thing you need to define. What do you mean by quality? What is quote unquote better quality? Right? There's no universal definition for what quality is. Right? I use a very straightforward one. Quality is in the wallet of the buyer. The buyer will tell you what they consider to be quality when they put money down on the table. Now, if I'm an industrial chocolate maker, right, my quality, my primary quality parameters are probably 2. How much does the cocoa cost? And can I use these cocoa beans to make a chocolate I already know how to make, so I don't need to play with my recipe? Right? So we all have a basket of attributes, right? We all may share the same attributes in our basket. Some people might have different attributes in theirs, but then we have to weight the attributes that are in there. How much am I willing to pay for this? And that's a determination of quality, right? What I'm willing to pay for determines what is quality. So for some people, right, an almond joy, right, is quality. And it may be because it reminds them of some very, very specific childhood memory. And for them, it's a quality product, right? If we're talking about a craft chocolate, what we think of as quality is going to be this basket of attributes which might have to do with wow, there are lots of interesting flavors, or I'm treating my farmers well, or I'm using this unusual flavoring, but I'm not using lecithin or some other ingredient which is going to change the texture just because it makes it easier to make the chocolate. Okay? So think about quality in a very different way, because your definition of quality is different from mine. And it has to be, because I have this very different set of experiences. I've been working in chocolate for 25 years. I've tasted, many, many hundreds. I don't know if it reaches 1,000 at this point. And what I value, what I appreciate in a chocolate is very, very different. Yes.
I have a question. Okay, because of course we all look to buy organic, and like I know, like in coconuts, for example, you can buy organic coconut milk, but I've heard it really doesn't matter because they're not really using pesticides on the coconut palms, right? So, are there a lot of pesticides used in
So are there a lot of agricultural inputs in general? So we might say synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and things like that.
Is there a reason to buy organic craft chocolate versus a good reason versus non-organic craft chocolate? Because there are, like organic brands out there.
Right. So is there a reason to buy organic chocolate in general compared with regular chocolate?
Okay.
So we'll leave it there. The short answer is no. If the farmer is being diligent with respect to following rules and regulations. So if I spray my tree with a pesticide, the worst that will happen is that the pesticide will be on the outside of the pod. Right?
It's not really as you know, some fruits and vegetables
Right.
absorb more. Into,
Right, but it needs to go through
Yeah.
in this particular case, a very thick pod in order to get at it. And if I wait the recommended amount of time before harvesting, so generally a week to 2, right, and there's been a rain, chances are there's not going to be so. With cocoa, what you have to worry about is after it's harvested, whoever is taking the seeds out of the pod is not wearing gloves. Right, so anything that's on the outside of the pod will be transferred to there. But it's going into the pulp, and so it's going to break down, deliquesce, and turn into juice and drip off. And so, we're diluting that. But am I drinking the juice? Am I consuming the pulp? We might need to worry about it to some extent. Right? So, for example, the cacao tree is a bioaccumulator of cadmium. So if there is cadmium in the soil, it will uptake into that. So there's nothing you can do in the manufacturing process to reduce.
That's not the cadmium is not good, or is it? Too much cadmium. The cadmium.
Cadmium can be toxic if you consume too much.
So
The body has a tendency to eliminate it. The body is not a bioaccumulator of.
Someone else talking about that. So
Right.
you're saying that the tree can actually, if there's too
Concentrate.
much cadmium in the soil,
Right, yeah.
can actually
Yes.
absorb too much cadmium. So you don't want to be growing them where there's too much cadmium in the soil because it absorbs it.
So it's a great question, but it's about the difference between hazard and risk. Cadmium is a hazard, right? But is cadmium in cocoa a risk that we need to worry about? And all of this controversy is based around California's maximum allowable daily limit.
There's been these recently news things where they found so much lead in chocolate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So where did that all come from?
So I'm going to get there, okay? So it's important to understand that you tend to excrete cadmium, right? Whereas lead is a bioaccumulator, the body is. So you need to be more aware of lead consumption than you do cadmium consumption. We'll start that as a baseline. And so some people will say there is no acceptable level of lead consumption, right?
California says there's no acceptable levels of many things, pretty much, right?
Right, but the Prop 65 limits when it comes to lead and cadmium notice they're only selectively enforced. We only care about lead in the press and cadmium in the press when it comes to chocolate or baby food, right? And there's a reason why. It's because people care about babies and they care about chocolate in ways they don't care about spinach. Leafy vegetables, or if you're in Flint, right? And there are a lot of Michiganders here, so it's an issue. But on the list of potential exposure vectors for lead and cadmium, chocolate is in the bottom 5 of the top 10, right? Just to get that way. And the California maximum allowable daily limit is 1/1000th of the federal level, and it's based on inhaling, not consuming. And so the epidemiology of inhaling lead dust or inhaling cadmium dust are very different from consumption. If you have a healthy metabolism, so you don't have an underlying medical condition like anemia. So anemia will make your body less likely to process the lead and cadmium and excrete it. So if you're not getting enough iron, right, it's a problem. If you have other medical conditions, then the uptake of any kind of toxins is going to be a challenge. If you are, 10 years old, you're not 10 years old. But if you're younger, right, and you have a lower body weight, you are much more at risk than if you're older and are much heavier. So there is no way to say this is a maximum limit which applies to everyone, right? So, if you are anemic, if you're taking an iron supplement, then you're less likely to be worried. But I have colleagues of mine who eat a lot of chocolate and cocoa powder from South America, which is volcanoes. Volcanoes are usually the source of cadmium. And when you actually get the lab tests, which are specific for lead and cadmium retention in the body, it turns out you're still way below the limits, right? But again, right, if you are truly worried about, get yourself tested. But I just want to talk about it.
Everything else, organic, non-organic,
Right. So in cocoa, there is very little evidence that organic farming has an effect on the flavor of what's going on, right? There are other things that can be done to improve the health of the soil, which are going to have an effect on tree health. And in general, what you want to do is you want to have healthy trees in order to have healthy pods, in order to have quality in the sense that they will be able to deliver good flavor, right? Cocoa beans. And so that doesn't have a whole lot to do with whether or not you're using fertilizers or not, or pesticides or not. In reality, most cocoa farmers don't earn enough to buy agricultural chemicals, either pesticides or fertilizers. And so by default, the vast majority of cocoa in the world is grown organically, but not organically certified.
Most of them also don't have the money to try to get any kind of certification either.
But that's also something to understand about fair trade certification. So whether it's FLO, so Fair Trade Licensing Organization, or Rainforest Alliance /UTZ, is they don't certify individual farmers, right? They only certify large organizations. No, I don't take it personally, right? Because you need to be a cooperative of many hundreds, if not more, in order to be able to afford the certification. Or you need to have an NGO, so a non-governmental organization, a nonprofit that's underwriting the cost of certification. But individual farmers, right, cannot afford. I could be an estate holder, I could be a wealthy landowner that's growing cacao and I can afford the certification. But in general, the individual smallholder farmer is not organically certified. If you're trying to do organic certification, it might be because you believe that your agricultural practices are such that the organic certification
That's
is
interesting because that's what you see more of actually rather than organic is all the fair trade or whatever which tends to be large businesses as large brands. as you
right.
say.
So
The smaller brands can't.
I'm going to say something controversial around fair trade, right? And I'm going to use un-PC language in order to do it, right? So fair trade is, okay, we've been cultural oppressors up here in the global north, right? So white people up here, and we've been taking advantage of farmers for like 500 years. And so, but all of a sudden we've found some ethics, right? And what we want these people we've been oppressing for 500 years to adopt our ethics and our things, which has basically to do with record keeping, right? We want you to keep records so that we can satisfy ourselves that you're doing things the way we want you to do them, right? So it's a bunch of
I get it.
white people in the global north telling brown people in the global south what's fair.
Yeah.
And then we're saying to them, we want you to pay for the privilege of adopting our new ethics. Oh, and by the way, we're not going to accept any market risk. We're not going to guarantee to buy all of the cocoa or whatever product is certified, right, at the market rate plus the premium. We're going to leave you with all the market risk. So fair trade is, in my opinion, most of the time, just a socially acceptable form of neo-economic imperialism. That's all. That's what it is, and that's a controversial statement to make, right? There is no guarantee that if you buy something which is labeled fair trade, that in fact all of the promises that the organization.
It's getting tiring because nowadays it's like everything.
Yeah. Well, but it's a part of a corporate whitewashing / greenwashing for the most part.
I mean, it's
right.
obvious, but it's not.
Right.
Just more and more and more.
Yeah. So for a company, for example, like Cocoa Supply, Lila, it's like, oh yeah, they know all the farmers they're buying from. And if you were to go down there and want to visit them, you'd be able to go and visit their farms and see their practices. And it's not like I'm announcing 3 months in advance that I'm showing up so you can clean up for the certification process. There's another component which is not talked about as much, which is called direct trade. And the notion of direct trade is to reduce the number of changes of ownership, right, or changes of custodianship from the farm to your back door. So you want to do that. It's rare that a company will directly import their own stuff. You need to buy a certain amount before it makes sense that I'm going to buy a whole container and ship a whole container over and do all the import paperwork and export paperwork myself. So there aren't a whole lot of companies that are actually directly trading in that respect, right? There's always some intermediaries. Even if you're directly trading, you need a company that's going to take it from the farm to the port, right? So it's a real challenge. But the notion of direct trade that I think is most important has to do with a sense of long-term commitment and personal relationships. So if you want to say you're a direct trade chocolate maker, you've been to the farms, right? You've shake the hands of the farmers, right? And you visit them on a regular basis, right? So there is this, so it's a relationship more than it is a process. So it's like bean to bar. What does bean to bar mean? So it just means I buy beans and I make bars, right? And there's been this 20-year kerfuffle about, well, I have to own all the equipment, right? And it needs to be in my factory and I need to control it and all that kind of stuff. It's like, well, it turns out that exporting cocoa beans is least beneficial to the farmers in the producing country, right? Because they're not adding any value to it. And it's actually the most expensive when it comes to carbon footprint. So does it make more sense? And could I possibly bean to bar is once a year, I'm the chocolate maker. I'm going to go to a producing country. I'm going to see the beans that I buy and somebody locally is going to roast and then convert those beans into liquor under my supervision, right? And what I'm doing, because when I export cocoa beans, 20% waste. And that doesn't include the pallets. It doesn't include the jute bags. Well, the pallets have their own waste stream. The jute bags have their own waste streams. And maybe I'm using polypropylene, which is a form of plastic. Why are we saying that in order to be bean to bar, I have to bring beans into my facility? It makes no sense. So I think it's a matter of supervision, right? Yeah. Right? But it's just a process, right? Lindt is a bean to bar chocolate company. So how does a small maker who's making, who's processing a metric ton of beans a year or 5, how does bean to bar differentiate what they do from a big company? It makes no sense, which is why I like Kraft and the definition around industrial, right? Now, I'm an industrial chocolate maker. I could use commodity beans. I'm a Kraft chocolate maker. I could use commodity beans, right? So for example, if I'm buying beans from Ghana, I'm buying beans from Ghana because I want to produce a chocolate that has got this very, very familiar flavor profile that everybody recognizes and loves. Ghana is the reference flavor for cocoa when it comes to chocolate. And so the reason I would have them use a Ghanaian bean, a commodity Ghanaian bean, is because I want to produce a chocolate that is accessible. People will go, yum, it's familiar. It reminds me of stuff, right?
Why did Ghana become the flavor profile? Because they're cheaper?
The government decided. Right. So Ghana is it's the largest country in the world in which the cocoa economy is completely controlled by the government.
Right. cheaper, right?
It's
Or
it's
maybe
it's not
not
it's not necessarily cheaper.
Okay.
That's not the reason why they're doing it, because what the government of Ghana decided to do is we want to sort of regularize the cocoa industry so that what we could do is we could produce a very consistent product. So that what it means is that a trader sitting at a trading desk in Chicago can pick up the phone and talk to a trader located in, well, Abidjan is in the Ivory Coast, so Accra in Ghana, and say, I want to buy 40 containers of cocoa. And he knows what he's going to buy because there's a standardization of flavor, which has happened. So that's what the government of Ghana has done. A country like Ecuador says, there's no price control. We're not doing anything to regulate the market in that way. If there is an organization that sets up to by the exporters or by the producers to facilitate certain aspects of the business, they can do whatever it is they want. They can sell for whatever price they want. There's, the only thing is, we need the tax record when you sell, right? And we need the phytosanitary certificate on export to make sure that it in fact is safe to export, right? But these represent very, very different approaches to the market. But Ghana became one of the largest producers in the world, since been eclipsed by the Ivory Coast, because of this focus on consistency, whether or not you thought the quality was any good. If I'm a craft chocolate maker, it's boring, right? Because it only produces cocoa flavor, and that's boring, right? When there are all these other flavors that could be produced.
But American chocolate, I just feel that in general, in the past, they just throw in lots of sugar, and that becomes the predominant flavor that people don't even.
Well, that's
notice
global.
that,
That's global. That's global. I mean, so
chocolate flavor.
so Milton Hershey's genius is not.
But anyway.
Milton Hershey's genius is not that he made good chocolate. It's that he made chocolate affordable, right? So chocolate as we know it today did not exist prior to the Industrial Revolution. Cheese existed prior to the, beer, spirits, bread, olive oil. All of these things had traditions of appreciation and connoisseurship, which stretched back hundreds, if not thousands of years. So Porto is the first denomination in wine. It's 400 years old or something like that. Right? Prior to the Industrial Revolution, chocolate was 99% drunk as a beverage, and it was very locally made product. That started to change in the 1760s or thereabouts. So we have the Baker Company, right? Again, their genius is they figured out how to manufacture chocolate and wrap it so they could distribute it beyond 50 miles. Right? This is before refrigeration. I mean, refrigeration is one of the most important inventions in chocolate, right, that most people don't appreciate. But again, Milton Hershey's genius is he figured out how to make chocolate affordable by replacing the expensive ingredient, which is cocoa, with cheap ingredients, which are milk and sugar. And he didn't actually invent that, right? He saw what it is that Henri Nestle and Daniel Peter were doing with milk chocolate in Switzerland. He saw what was going on in England with the Fry family, Quakers, the Rowntree Quakers, the Cadbury Quakers, saw what they were doing and said, oh, I'm going to do that here in the United States. But Milton Hershey made his fortune selling caramels. And ironically, what made Milton Hershey's caramels so successful is that if you were doing a cooked sugar caramel in the mid-1800s, you added paraffin wax to keep it chewy, right? And the milk caramels, Hershey didn't invent, he bought the recipe, right, from someone, were chewy, but didn't have wax in them. So I think it's ironic that people say Hershey adds wax to their product because they don't. It would have to be listed as an ingredient, right? But he made his fortune actually abandoning wax in caramels. But he went to the 1893 Chicago Exposition, saw this display of German-made chocolate manufacturing equipment, said chocolate is the future, went back to Hershey, sold the caramel business to buy all the equipment from the Germans, and then headed off to Europe to figure out how to make chocolate, right? Eventually going to the Rowntrees and the Cadburys and the Frys and saying, how do you do it? And in the process, he made a mistake. So if you're not very careful about how you make sweetened condensed milk, the milk can go slightly sour. And that's what Hershey didn't know. And so he was making his milk chocolate early on with milk that had gone slightly sour. But at that point, nobody knew what milk chocolate was supposed to taste like. And so they just figured it was the way milk chocolate tastes like it. But for a nickel, I could buy a lot of it as opposed to whatever other people were making. And so we're living with an industrial mistake now. We're living with an industrial manufacturing mistake 125 years or so after it was made. And now what they do is they actually add that flavor in, right? They can't actually replicate that. They don't want to replicate that flavor by making the manufacturing mistake. So what they do is they identified the chemical that is responsible for that flavor. And now they add that. When you say flavoring in a Hershey, that's the flavor they're adding in is the flavor of sour milk, something called butyric acid, which is one of the things that makes baby vomit smell the way baby vomit smells. And that's why Europeans who grow up or on Cadbury and other kinds of chocolate, they smell American chocolate, but it's specifically Hershey, right? There are no other brands that do the same thing, but people allied Hershey with all American chocolate, which is not the case. So, but yeah, it's kind of weird that way. But this modern craft chocolate movement is in many respects retro, because if I go over and see the people from the Philippines who are the first one in on the right as you walk in, they're making what are called 2-ingredient chocolate. So they're only at cocoa beans and sugar. Well, that's the way chocolate was made prior to the addition of cocoa butter, right, which is a modern invention in the 1800s. So in some respects, craft chocolate is a retro movement. We're going back to manufacturing methods which predate the Industrial Revolution. But at the same time, it's very modern because what we're trying to do is we're trying to create this culture of appreciation and connoisseurship in chocolate, which has existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years for all the other foods we love, but didn't exist in chocolate. Nobody really thought about it because if we had an idea of quality, it had to do with bonbons. It had to do with pralines, what the Belgians called. It had to do with candy, confections, and not really about the chocolate itself. And that's what's new and different about the craft chocolate movement, is they're thinking about let's create a culture of an appreciation, a culture of appreciation and connoisseurship about the chocolate itself. And that's brand new. And we're doing it from scratch. And we've only been doing it for 20 some odd years. And so there's still a lot of work to be done to get people to understand why they should care, which is one of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing here in Rushville, right? Is to help people understand why it makes a difference, why people should care. More questions?
Does chocolate expire?
Does chocolate expire? Yes, it does. But I would say that the rate at which chocolate expires is going to be related to how much non-cocoa, non-sugar ingredients there are in what you're doing. So cocoa is full of antioxidants, right? So there are all these sorts of things. And antioxidants are going to keep it from spoiling, right? Right. Sugar, nothing grows in sugar as long as it doesn't get wet. So when you combine cocoa and sugar, you've got something which is incredibly stable. It will not go off until it gets wet. So just those two things, right? Right. However, bars are tempered, which means what we want to do is we want to force a specific crystal structure in the cocoa butter. So cocoa butter will form into 6 different crystal structures. Of those 6, only 1 gives us what we really like in the way of chocolate. Okay. But the crystals will continue to grow, and they will change from what is called form 5 crystals to form 6 crystals over time. And so if you've ever had a bar which was at its best by date or a little bit beyond, and it was crispy crunchy and really, really difficult to melt, that's because the crystals had changed from form 5 into form 6. The form 6 crystal structure melts at a much higher temperature. and is very resistant to melting. So when you bite it, right, your mouth has to exert a whole lot more energy to warm up the chocolate to get it melt, and often it won't. Right? Now it's still not ruined. All you have to do is melt out all the crystals. Right. So if you ever have a crispy, crunchy bar, the best thing to do with it is, if it's unpleasant to eat, is melt it into hot chocolate or bake with it. Right. Just melt it, and all above 115 degrees Fahrenheit, 45 degrees centigrade. Keep it there for at least 10 to 15 minutes to melt out all the crystals, and now you can use it as you would use any melted chocolate. Right. Now, if you add a milk product to it, so whether it's dark chocolate, a dark milk chocolate, a milk chocolate, or a white chocolate, it is the milk fat, right, that is going to be more subject to going rancid. And that's where you go. It's also tends to be a little more hygroscopic, right? And so it'll absorb moisture, which is, compounds things. So one of the things you want to do if you have chocolate is you want to make sure that no moisture associates with it. So it's okay to put chocolate in the refrigerator or in the freezer, but what you want to do is you want to temper it. So put it in the refrigerator, let it cool down. You want to make sure that there's no moisture that condenses. So a little silica gel packet or a paper towel inside a plastic freezer bag, right? So look at it and say there's no moisture on it. And then you can put it in the freezer, right? And that will hold it at that for however long, right? But take it out of the freezer, put it back in the refrigerator, right? And then make sure that when you take it out of the refrigerator, no moisture condenses on it. So if the moisture condenses on it, what it'll do is it'll pull the sugar out of suspension. So you have what's called sugar bloom. You'll see it as a crispy, shiny kind of thing. It's ruined the texture of the chocolate. There's nothing you can do in terms of melting and retempering to get back to the original texture. You can try, if we don't care about the sugar, you can melt it and vigorously blend it and turn it into something you can drink.
I was like, so can you use it for baking at that point or not?
Depends on what you're baking, right? If you want to put it, if you want to put it in a cake where the flour particles are really, really big, then probably. But if you're going to make pot de creme or a pudding or something like that, no, it won't work, right? So, right. The other thing you've got is what's called flat fat bloom or cocoa butter bloom, and that's when the chocolate gets warm and then cold quickly. And what that does is it pulls some of the cocoa butter out of suspension in the chocolate, right? And it comes on the surface. It generally doesn't ruin the taste. It generally doesn't ruin the texture. Although if it's extreme or it happens many times, it can start to get flat and stale, and it might affect the texture of the chocolate. But it's been that badly melted, all you do is melt it down, right? If you have the experience, you can retemper it, right? But it's generally very, very hard to retemper very, very small amounts of chocolate. But yeah, turn it into a beverage, bake with it, right? Turn it into a chocolate sauce. All those kinds of things are things you can do with chocolate. But it will go off, right? But at room temperature, a dark chocolate, as long as it doesn't overcrystallize, 2 years. And room temperature is 20 degrees centigrade, 68 Fahrenheit, 66 to 72. If it gets much warmer, it does that. It reduces the shelf life, right? Unless, of course, what the manufacturer has done is they've put ingredients in it that extend the shelf life. So, for example, you may see milk fat on an ingredient list, right? We would call this, if I were Indian, we'd call it ghee, right? We might call it anhydrous milk fat, which means milk fat without water, right? Butter oil, ghee, right? When you mix it into the chocolate, it softens the crystal structure, it lowers the melting point, but it also keeps the chocolate, it slows down the crystallizing. And so milk fat is used as a preservative to extend shelf life, even though it's not technically a preservative. Right? So look at the ingredients list, and if you see something like milk fat, that's one of the reasons why it's in there. They can't add the fat in there. The law, the regulations around it don't allow them anything which imitates the flavor of butter. Right? So it's just there as a processing component to make it work. Right? But one of the things that craft chocolate makers tend to do is they tend to eschew, right, any kind of processing aid. So if they're going to put anhydrous milk fat, it's probably going to be ghee, and it's ghee for a particular reason because it's part of a flavoring component, or they're talking about something which is Indian influenced in terms of the flavor. They're not trying to hide it as a processing ingredient to extend shelf life. If they're using lecithin, which is used as an emulsifier, even though chocolate is not an emulsion, it's not an oil-water mix, right? It's particles in suspension in fat. So chocolate is a suspension, not emulsion. What they're doing with the lecithin is to reduce surface tension and to bind with the water that creates the surface tension, right? So that it is more fluid, right? Which means it flows into the mold more easily. And lecithin is less expensive than cocoa butter.
But does that, I mean, you see that in a lot of American chocolate, right? So
A lot of chocolate globally, doesn't matter.
does
It's
that
not just
affect-
American
do you feel
chocolate.
that affects the flavor?
For an industrial chocolate, no. I mean, it's not. So what's going to happen is it's going to affect the way the chocolate melts in your mouth and the way your saliva interacts with the chocolate in your mouth. And so that is going to have an effect on flavor, right? Whether or not you're able to detect the flavor, you need to.
Well, okay, I understand. Like, I don't like to buy any cream that has any kind of thickener in it. I
Right.
go for non-homogenized grass-fed cream.
Right. So if anybody who's throwing guar gum or xanthan gum or anything
Yeah.
like that, just like avoid that stuff because
lots of things, or yogurt, anything, you can immediately tell that it's got some kind of emulsifier in it. So I feel like
right.
rather pure yogurt, rather ones where they've added things.
In general, I agree with you, and for the most part, I will agree with you in chocolate. What most of the industry has done is they've moved away from soy lecithin because soy often is GMO, and the way you find out if a lecithin is non-GMO is there's not enough non-GMO soybeans to make non-GMO lecithin. What you do is you test the lecithin you make to find out if there are any genetic markers for GMO in it, and if there are no markers, you label it as non-GMO, which is a little weird. But most of the industry has moved away from soy lecithin to sunflower lecithin. But sunflower-derived lecithin is less effective for its purposes in chocolate, and so you need to add more of it in order to achieve the same results. It's still significantly less expensive than cocoa butter, which is, if you're a chocolate maker, what you're going to do is you're going to add cocoa butter to it to achieve the same effect. But yeah, look at the ingredients, right? So PGPR is a synthetic emulsifier. So it's used to replace lecithin because it's cheaper than lecithin and they don't have to worry about non-GMO aspects of it, but it is still synthesized in the lab, right? So, it's trading one devil for another devil right? But it is all based upon increasing manufacturing efficiency, reducing the likelihood of manufacturing defects, right? And also reducing costs because it's an ingredient that's less expensive. But it's all about controlling manufacturing costs, right? Will it have an effect on taste? The fact is that one of the confusions that many people have is calling candy bars chocolate, right? So if I am a Snickers bar, for example, or Three Musketeers, it's basically sugar in some form, caramel or nougat, right? And there's this very thin layer of something which might be termed chocolate. But if you were just eat the chocolate around it, you go, it's not very good, right? It's not very tasty. But that's not the point of a Snickers bar. It's not the chocolate. It's the peanuts and caramel and nougat that are in there. In the Three Musketeers, it's the texture of the nougat. It's not really about the chocolate. All right. Well, the time has gone very, very quickly. I mean, I'm happy to wait this until the last minute. But we didn't get any questions about fermentation. You asked questions. We didn't get any questions about alcohol. We didn't question about. What was the question? Oh, so you asked a question about markets. This is the very end, and it's very, very geeky and economics and all that kind of stuff. So it turns out that there has been very few instances where a craft chocolate maker has been invested in by a large company, right? Now, there are some instances where brands have been created specifically for national distribution in retail grocery, where we've seen they've been bought up by big companies. So for example, Hugh Kitchen was purchased by Mondelez, which is the confectionery brand spun off from Kraft. Other people may not know that.
No, I know Mondelez is massive.
Mondelez is massive, one of the largest companies in the world. But Kraft, which is the predecessor to Mondelez, bought up Cadbury, right, which bought up Green and Blacks. So we've seen a secondary series, but Green and Blacks was a brand in global distribution. And knowing Craig Sams, who's one of the, and his wife Joanna, who are the founders of Green and Blacks, visited their facilities down in Belize in 2010, that they realized that in order to achieve what they wanted to achieve with Green and Blacks, they needed an influx of capital. And when they lost control, Cadbury said, we're going to do things. And then they sold to Mondelez or Kraft, and all bets were off. So Hugh is now owned by Mondelez. The brand Lily's is owned by Hershey. Right? And one of the things that happened with both Hugh and with Lily's is that after the purchase, their supply chains changed. And so they're now using different cocoa than they used to use. And so there's been a subtle but fundamental shift in the taste of the products that are being done. Hershey actually tried to do this in the mid-2000s, but they realized they couldn't present themselves as a gourmet brand. So they set up a subsidiary, Hershey Artisan Confections, and they bought Scharfenberger and Dagoba, and then a confectioner in San Francisco called Joseph Schmidt. And they tried to make a go of it. The only one of those three they still own is Dagoba, I believe. They closed down Joseph Schmidt within a year of buying it. They couldn't figure out how to market an upmarket brand. And so it was devastating. Scharfenberger was spun off into a private company, and then Scharfenberger just resold itself. So they're now owned. But if we think of any of the startup craft brands, none of them, right, is big enough to enter, and none of them have the kind of brand equity at retail grocery to make them interesting acquisition targets. I mean, overall, the craft chocolate movement in 20 years has grown to represent about 1% of the market. Of a $180 billion market, all of the makers, everywhere in the world, all the makers, probably less than $2 billion total at retail. So we got a long way to go before,
Could you just talk for a minute on Ruby chocolate and
Ruby.
Dubai chocolate?
Okay.
If they're worthwhile with pursuing?
So Ruby chocolate is an interesting research question, right? Because Barry Callebaut, who are the people who brought Ruby to market, they didn't invent any of the processes. What they did is they figured out how to commercialize the process at scale, right? You ask the question, why does chocolate have to be brown? The seeds, when they're fresh, are shades of purple. So why does chocolate have to be brown? And so everything about Ruby is how do we keep the cocoa beans from oxidizing during fermentation and drying, and then how do we keep it from changing color in the manufacturing process? That is Ruby. And so there is an essential sort of fruitiness to a fresh cocoa beans if you get rid of the bitterness, right? So bitterness and astringency are very, very strong sensations in the mouth. And if you can reduce them, you can let other flavors come forward. And so everything about Ruby is that. But the Ruby, RB1 that you're purchasing, is basically white chocolate, right? So the Ruby, there is no such thing as a Ruby cocoa bean. It's any genetic variety of cocoa which has got a specific flavor, not chemical profile, right? That's it. So there's no Ruby bean. All that is marketing hogwash, right? But Ruby, actually, from a cocoa content perspective, Ruby is less than 5% cocoa. All the rest of it is sugar and milk, for the most part, right? The cocoa bean is in there just to give it flavor.
Is it worth pursuing, or just try it once? Or
If you like it, the answer is yes.
I've seen it.
It's very Moorish. I mean, it's designed to hit a bliss point where, like a Beaujolais, you put a little bit in your mouth, you drink a little bit, and then 30 seconds later you realize, oh, that was nice, but how come there's no more in my mouth? And you drink it again and you don't really think about it. That's Ruby.
What's special about Dubai chocolate?
There's nothing special about Dubai chocolate. It's not a particular chocolate. What you do is you take a specific form of phyllo dough and you mix pistachio paste with that phyllo dough and you put it into a chocolate bar. Okay. The only reason why it's called viral Dubai chocolate is because TikTok doesn't know what the F they're talking about. There's no specific chocolate, but there's no one recipe for Dubai chocolate either. You could take different forms of phyllo, but it's all about taking a filled chocolate bar with pistachio paste and phyllo and making something. Anything? All right, we be done. Thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the show. Oops, I'm going to turn the camera off now. No!
Oh, you didn't turn it on?